everybody knows, we are going to record these webinars and send them around so that folks that cannot join can get up to speed on some of the topics that we're talking about. So just a warning that you are being recorded if you ask questions. And so let's jump right in. We are hosting these webinars. This is new for the Business Network. We're going to have one every month on the fourth Friday of every month to talk about issues that the Business Network has indicated they're interested in learning more about, or updating folks on issues that we're working on. And in the calendar appointment, I sent around an agenda for the remainder of this year on the issues that we'll cover. Some of them are very tentative, and so if any Business Network members or folks on the phone want to suggest a topic that we cover, I would love to hear from you. And we want to pull in other groups working on these issues and get expertise outside of the Business Network engaged in what we're doing. And so if you have folks that you work with already on certain topics, we'd love to include them in these sessions. So today we're covering the Lake Erie algal blooms, and these are harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie, the Lake Erie Basin. We are going to go over what happened in Toledo in 2014. We're going to go over what's causing these harmful algal blooms to occur in Lake Erie, what algal blooms mean for the economy. Some policy solutions will be sprinkled into the PowerPoint throughout. And then we're going to hear from a couple business owners that are in the Lake Erie Basin, the Lake Erie Charter Boat Association, on how they've been working in this space already and how our network can assist in trying to advance policies and solutions around this issue. And I'll start off by saying that I'm sure many folks within the network know that algal blooms are not isolated to Lake Erie. In fact, last year there was a bloom in Lake Superior. And so this is an issue that will affect the entire basin, and we need to put in place solutions that can address algal blooms in general, and not, it doesn't necessarily have to be focused just on Lake Erie, but that is where the largest problem is occurring currently. Do folks have any questions about the agenda? All right, great. We'll go right into it. So I'm going to kick it off to my coworker, Frank Solosky, who is from Toledo and has some very personal anecdotes about what it was like in 2014 and how this has changed his life personally and professionally.
Thanks, Beth, and I thank Captain Paul Pachowski for being on. Anybody who lives in the western basin of Lake Erie definitely had their life touched by the increasing severity and unpredictability of these harmful algal blooms and the microcystin, which is the toxin that is produced by these blooms. In 2014 in South Toledo, I was awoken by a neighbor who Saturday morning he yelled through a window in early August, "Hey Frank, don't drink the water. Don't let your kids drink the water. It's been poisoned." And needless to say, it rousted me up out of bed on the second floor, and I sort of rubbed the dust out of my eyes and turned on the television, and lo and behold, the city at 3 a.m. had issued a do not drink advisory because microcystin, which is turns out to be more toxic substance than arsenic, was detected at a alarming level in the city water system. And it was greatly disturbing, but unfortunately not surprising, because the year before, Paul's colleague Dave Spengler and others in Ottawa County went through the same thing at a much smaller scale. When a smaller community in Ottawa County, closer to Cedar Point, experienced the same emergency. And at National Wildlife Federation, we had been ringing the bell of alarm over the growth and severity of algal blooms for several years. And so Toledo was an infamous example, but Captain Paul and others have been dealing with this scourge, and my colleague Gail Hess, who you'll hear from momentarily, for some years. In professionally, it has meant leaning into policy change at the local, state, and national and international level. It's meant engaging with row crop farmers and agribusinesses such as CAFOs, which have been increasingly located in the Maumee River Basin, western basin of Lake Erie. It's a problem that involves complex science and law, and there's a climate change element to it that is making matters worse as far as already observed increasing very heavy rainstorms that is accelerating the hydrologic cycle and pushing more nutrient runoff into the western basin. Waters are warming. There's a greater concentration of CO2. All those things conspire to make matters worse. And so the business community stepped up before for Lake Erie. I have a slide that talks about how in the 1970s, the EPA and other businesses stepped up to reduce detergents and other substances that largely solved this problem during the era of when the Cuyahoga River caught fire. And Lake Erie was the national poster child as the dead lake. Businesses were involved then, and there's a considerable role for businesses to play now. And so I'll just leave it there. I mean, I also have a few slides talking about the economic impact of these blooms on real estate values and tourism. And it's well studied and documented, the economic impact of either addressing this and protecting clean drinking water and our region's image, or not. And so with that, Beth, I'll pass the baton.
Great. Thank you so much, Frank. And we are now going to look at the science of what is causing the harmful algal blooms, and I'm going to hand it over to another colleague of mine, Gail Hess, who has been working on this issue, forever. And she is an expert both within our office, and she's known as an expert within the region. And Gail, I'll let you do a little bit more formal introduction, but thank you for joining. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Beth. And to say that I've been working on it forever makes me sound quite on in years, but it's only to say that I've been with NWF a little over 3 years, but prior to that, I was with the state of Ohio, first with Ohio EPA, and then I retired as the executive director of the Ohio Lake Erie Commission and started working on the algal blooms in Lake Erie back while I was still with Ohio EPA, and before we got to the crisis point as we were discerning the trends of the increases in the algal blooms, but certainly not to the scale of what we've seen in recent years. So with that, I guess let me mention this to you, Beth, in that up in the top of the screen where it says view options, it says request remote control. And I'm wondering if I do that, if it's possible that I could then advance the slides. I'm going to hit request. And let's see if this works. Yep. Did you do that or did I do that? Okay, well, let's start here with an overview of the Great Lakes overall. This is just a useful reminder that Lake Erie is the southernmost and also the shallowest of all of the Great Lakes. And then what that means in terms of how it looks in profile. Next slide. Oops. Next slide. There we go. It becomes important to look at this in profile when we talk about Lake Erie, in that we talk about it in the context of the three basins, Western, Central, and Eastern. And the majority of the large-scale algal blooms are concentrated in the Western Basin, which is bounded on the north by Point Pelee and to the south with Sandusky Bay in Ohio. And it's not to say that the Central and the Eastern Basins don't have issues. They do, but the large-scale blooms originate in the Western Basin. There are also some more localized near-shore algal blooms, and we'll see a satellite image of that. But then in the Eastern Basin, that experiences a different kind of algae called Cladophora. And while that is not a toxin-inducing type of algae, it does create some significant beach fouling and other ecological issues in that part of the lake. And so that's also a reminder to say that not all algal blooms are toxic algal blooms, but what we are seeing is an increase in these type of blooms, also known as cyanobacteria. And the cyanobacteria are capable of producing toxins. They don't always produce toxins, but what they require are heavy concentration for them to experience the bloom. Okay, next slide.
Gail, sorry, I was on mute when I said I think you are controlling it. And then I just want to remind folks, if you're not speaking, to mute your line. I don't want to mute all because we do have guest speakers on. Thank you so much. So Gail, try advancing if you wouldn't mind. There you go.
Okay, yeah. Oh, wait, let's go back. There we go. Yes, it does look like I am advancing. So, whoops, nope, I don't know what happened there.
Sorry, that might have been me because I'm trying to mute myself.
Okay.
There you go. Sorry.
All right, now you're not touching it, right?
Nope, not touching anything. Sorry.
Okay. All right, so why is the Western Basin experiencing this? And one of the primary reasons is that large orange blob there is the river basin of the Maumee River. It is a huge river basin of more than 4.5 million acres, all draining to that one point at the mouth, at its mouth in Toledo, Ohio. That's a large land area with close to 90% of it in agriculture. And so we've got a large land area draining to the smallest of the three basins of Lake Erie, but also the shallowest. So it's delivering quite a bit of concentrated nutrient-sourced water right into the Western Basin. And I'm trying to figure out which button it is that's advancing. There we go. Okay, and there's a satellite image of one of the more famous blooms in 2011. And up until 2011, we had not seen a bloom at this scale. And so this was the one that really took everyone by surprise. And one thing to note in this slide is a lot of people often ask how much of what's coming through the Detroit River contributes to the bloom. And the answer is that while the Detroit River does contribute phosphorus into Lake Erie, it's not at a high enough concentration to contribute to the large bloom in the Western Basin. And you can almost see that dilution effect in that particular satellite image. And then here's a picture of that same year, and this is just where the bloom migrated east into the Central Basin. and so there was a lot of question at the time as to whether or not the Central Basin was producing its own bloom, but the reality is that it was the migration of that large bloom eastward. On the other hand, when you look at the northern shore of Lake Erie, you do see green up there, and that's actually an example of some more localized near-shore blooms. And then here's just a closer in shot from an aerial photograph to see when it gets really thick. This is what it can look like. And this actually made a National Geographic photo of the day that following spring. And every year, NOAA does a bloom severity forecast. And here you can see the severity of the blooms over the course of the years. And you can see in 2011 was when it really jumped up. And interestingly enough, when we look at 2014, it wasn't the biggest of the blooms that we had, but yet that was the year of the Toledo water crisis. One of the reasons for that is that in that year, well, it was still a significant bloom. We also had a lot of wind out of the north that pushed the bloom southward and further down into the water column, right into the path of the intake for the Toledo water supply. And then, interestingly enough, followed by 2015, which is the largest bloom to date. Now, each year, what NOAA does, you'll see that red box off to the right, and that's referred to as a box and whiskers plot. And because this forecast is developed by a series of models, the forecast provides a range of what the maximum could be and what the minimum could be, and obviously the likely section. For the first time in 2018, the bloom did not hit the minimum, and the reason for that is because the forecast is developed by a series of different models. There's one model in particular that does not forecast well when the blooms are smaller. All the models tend to perform pretty well when there's going to be a significant bloom, but then they start to get a little squirrelier in the minimum blooms. I've heard from NOAA that it's unlikely that they will continue to use that particular model that caused such a difference in last year's forecast. And that forecast generally comes out around the second week in July. And then after that, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the HAB bulletin, which comes out twice a week during the season from NOAA, because it's important to remember that the bloom doesn't always stay in one place, that due to wind and water current, it can move around. And so it is important to know not only how big is it likely to be, but where is it? And then here's just a series of set of color enhanced images of the blooms over the years. And you can just see that it's been in more recent years that we're seeing more significant blooms. And there's 2017, we don't have 18 yet, but here's 2017 with the red indicating the highest severity. And here again, here's another satellite image that demonstrates that influence of the Detroit River, almost as having a more of a dilution effect, simply because it doesn't have the concentration. It is delivering a phosphorus load, but it doesn't have it at the concentration. This next slide is another comparison that helps to illustrate why we know, one of the reasons why we know it's coming from the Maumee is that 2011, which is the big bloom, that's the image that we saw recently, was followed by a drought year in 2012. And while we did see a bloom in 2012, it was really a fraction of what we've seen in the past. And we didn't have that big delivery of phosphorus-laden water coming down the Maumee due to the drought. But it also tells us that we're not seeing a lot of phosphorus release from the bottom sediments, because I often get the "but what about" questions in terms of bottom release of phosphorus, and also the impact of the zebra and the quagga mussels releasing phosphorus. And while those two issues do account for some release, it's not a major contributor, because otherwise in 2012, we would have seen a much larger bloom than what we did. It also tells us that at whatever point we can turn down the tap on phosphorus delivery into the Western Basin, that we know that the lake will respond. And so where is it coming from? There have been a number of efforts that have done a comprehensive analysis of the different sources. We first did this when I chaired the Lake Erie Phosphorus Task Force when I was with Ohio EPA, and it's since been confirmed by any number of other studies and modeling. One of the things that we know about point sources, and this is the wastewater treatment plants and other industrial discharges, is that their contributions have remained fairly constant, and they are not a large contributor of phosphorus into the lake. And in fact, several models have shown that even if we turned off all point sources draining into Lake Erie, it would have zero impact on the effect of the blooms. Now, one of the things to remember is that with the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement in the first round of that resulted in, as I think Frank mentioned, a phosphorus ban. And at the same time, there was a specific phosphorus limit put on the wastewater treatment plants at that time, and that led to a significant recovery of the lake. And that was prior to the issues that we're having now. What we know now is that that agriculture is the prevailing source, and that most of the load is delivered in the spring. And when we talk about spring, and this is what defines the forecast, it's from the beginning of March to the end of June. And that's when, and we track that through the spring, and in terms of total amount of load coming in, and that's and again, that provides the input to the forecast models. The issue is that it's not so much that farmers are applying more phosphorus, but it's more about how and when it goes on. Some people have actually, if you did a peanut butter type approach across the entire Maumee River Basin, the amount of phosphorus that we need to reduce equates to only either between 0.5 and 1 pound of phosphorus. But the issue again is when it goes on, whether that's in the spring or even in the fall or winter, and when it becomes available to that runoff. How it goes on is that what we've learned is that when fertilizer is applied, it needs to become in contact with the soil. So broadcasting fertilizer application, whether that's manure or commercial fertilizer, it matters whether or not it's put in contact with the soil, because otherwise it's sitting on that surface and available to rain and runoff. So all that to say too is that this is being exacerbated by climate change issues, in that we are experiencing much more frequent and intense rain events, and specifically in the fall, often when farmers are applying their fertilizer. The other thing that we know is that we have a lot of issues with what's called legacy phosphorus. Not all of the phosphorus is in equal amounts across a field, across a farm, much less a field. That through a number of studies, we are finding that there are often pockets of very high levels of phosphorus in the soil. And so understanding what's happening, not just on an individual farm, but on an individual field, becomes paramount for how we need to approach solving this issue. Then I mentioned the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and it was recently renegotiated and signed by the US and Canada in 2012. And one of the things that agreement called for was to develop phosphorus loading targets for Lake Erie. I participated in the work group for that, and we came up with targets for the lake, and specific targets for the Maumee, as well as those localized nearshore blooms. But we also developed targets for issues in the Central Basin, which have to do with low oxygen or hypoxic zones. And so primarily the easiest way to remember it is a 40% reduction from the Maumee, as well as several other priority tributaries for spring loading. And the reason why we included the other tributaries was because of those, again, localized nearshore blooms, but it's the only thing that's going to address the large Western Basin bloom is reducing the phosphorus loading from the Maumee River. So there are spring targets, and then the annual target is also a 40% reduction from all tributaries draining into Lake Erie, and that's to address those low oxygen or hypoxic areas in the Central Basin. Then this is a paper that we started out, that I'm a co-author on, that it started out as a white paper that's since been published in the journal, and trying to look at what do we know and what don't we know now that we've been at this, for 10 plus years. And one of the interesting things, so there's a couple of different pieces and parts of the science that are part of this, and I can share this this journal article with if anyone's interested. There's some researchers in here that are working specifically on edge of field runoff, measuring based on looking at different practices and measuring the water quality as it's coming off the field, so that we can better understand which practices and in what combination are going to make the most difference. Robin Wilson on this paper has also done a number of farmer surveys in trying to understand a farmer's perspectives with regards to this issue. And we know that she's now done it enough and this is specifically within the Maumee River Basin, that we can understand some trend information. And she's been able to unpack what are farmers most likely to do, where would they need incentives, and where do they need mandates. But there's also a lot of issues with farmers in terms of their sense of what she refers to as efficacy, and meaning how does a farmer perceive their own ability to successfully implement a particular practice, but also do they believe that practice is going to be effective at all. And in this paper, she had enough survey data over enough years to be able to look at some trends, and there were some very disturbing trends in what she found. In that, for some of the key practices that we're advocating for, there's a certain rate of adoption. I think it's close to 30% of new farmers adopting that practice. However, that's mirrored by almost an equal number of farmers dropping that practice. So we're not seeing a net gain in rate of adoption for specific practices. And this is also mirrored by some recent water quality data from Ohio EPA that shows that in 8 watersheds in the Maumee River Basin, we are not meeting those reduction targets called for by the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. We look at those targets both in terms of loading, the total load or amount, volume or amount that's going into the lake, but we can also look at the concentration of that phosphorus as we adjust it for the amount of flow in a given part of the river. So we call that a flow-weighted mean concentration. So what do we need? So what are the practices that we're calling for? And with the ag practices, I mentioned putting that fertilizer in contact with the soil. That's often referred to as subsurface placement. And a challenge for farm producers is that requires specialized equipment. It also changes other management dimensions to a farming operation. So that is a heavy lift in many ways to get to that practice. But this is one of the things that the white paper initiated was a funding bill in Ohio that a state rep and an Ohio state representative and Ohio state senator put together, SB 299, which is providing funding to get more of that equipment on the ground so that we can utilize and get better coverage of subsurface placement. Also, soil test informed application rates. In the past, farmers would soil test about once every 5 years and in one part of the field. what we now know is that, we need to go much more frequently, and we need to have much greater density for those soil tests. As I mentioned, we can often see a pocket of high legacy phosphorus in one part of a field, which is why we need the greater density. But in addition to these nutrient management practices, we also need to be considering the issue that we've got a water problem as well. With these frequent, intense storms, we also need to be looking at ways to manage water and that water runoff. And so that's both in terms of erosion control, but also water management. And there's a number of devices that are working with the tile system in agricultural fields. Basically, the general term of reference is drainage water management. And there's a variety of them that can help work with holding some of that water back in the tile systems. Tile drainage is designed to move water off the fields very quickly, but at the same time, they can also be used as a storage infrastructure while it's off the field, but not holding that water back so that we can pulse it out into the river in different ways, so that we can moderate the amount of when the nutrients get delivered into the lake. And we need to remove the barriers for practice adoption, whether they're both real and perceived. And this is speaking to some of the perception issues that Robin identified in her survey work, that we know that we've got real barriers, including the access to that subsurface placement, but also the perceived barriers of farmers knowing and understanding their own efficacy and their ability to implement, as well as their belief in the effectiveness of a given practice. And we certainly can't take our eye off the ball on research and monitoring. There's still a lot that we don't know, and there's still a lot that we need to refine in terms of what we know. And then we're also calling for that we need better frameworks for accountability. There have been a lot of funding sources that have been directed towards the MAMI to assist with cost share for different agricultural practices, but they're not being tied to water quality outcomes. And so we really need to be looking at new and different ways, so that whether it's funding or whether it's regulation, either way, that we need better mechanisms to tying those agricultural practices to water quality outcomes. And then I'll just end with these two slides. And some of you I'm sure are familiar with this book. And at one time in the original versions of this book, Dr. Seuss had this line in the book: "I hear things are just as bad up in Lake Erie." And after the resurgence of the lake, after the phosphorus ban that was mentioned earlier and the controls on the wastewater treatment plants, the lake recovered and the lake rebounded. And so it was interesting, and we saw for a lot of years, we saw a healthy Lake Erie. And it's also an example of a system that it's my belief that the system can recover, that Lake Erie at one point was a great symbol of ecosystem recovery, in that as a shallow lake with a relatively short retention time span in contrast to the other Great Lakes, it will replenish itself and will renew itself. But at that time, this is back in the late 80s, that there were a group of teachers and school children in Ohio that wrote to Dr. Seuss and said that, hey, at that time, the lake had been cleared up and that he shouldn't be besmirching Lake Erie. And Dr. Seuss wrote back. And then he said that he agreed that my 71 statement in the Lorax about the condition of Lake Erie needs revision. And I always like this second sentence, because it says, I should no longer be saying bad things, because due to great civic and scientific effort, it's now the home of happy, smiling fish. And so it takes both. It takes both the civic effort as well as the scientific effort to make a difference. And I'll also mention that, so in all of the books of the Lorax published after 1991, that sentence is no longer in that book. And so what's interesting is if you have an older copy of the Lorax, check it out, because the ones that do have that line in it, can command quite a bit of money on eBay if you choose to sell it. And so then I'll just end by saying that that with great science and civic effort, that we need to put our best foot forward in looking for a new recovery for Lake Erie. And then Beth, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you, Gail.
And I'm giving up remote control.
All right, okay. So we are lucky to have a couple additional guests on this webinar that I'm hoping can speak very directly to how their particular business was impacted and how they've engaged in this issue since they've had to deal with it head on. So I am going to turn over, let's see here, I'm hoping folks are not on mute. We have Dave and Paul, Kevin and Paul with the Lake Erie Boat Association. Hang on just a second, or Charter Boat Association. And I'm going to give you a couple slides here. I found some photos of you online. I hope you don't mind. And I'll leave it up to you on who wants to kick it off, but we look forward to hearing from both of your perspectives. And if you have any insight into how the Great Lakes Business Network can work within the space you've been working in, we'd love to hear from that.
Okay, well, I guess I can kick it off there.
Thank you.
What Lake Erie Charter Boat has been doing is we're taking a very proactive approach. We have, since 2013, we have been working with the Ohio EPA, and now in conjunction with Ohio State University of Toledo, we go out, collect water samples. We give tours of the Maumee River and in the lake with scientists doing adaptive science out on the water to teach people more about the issues on the water. And even in 2014, when I saw the problems appearing around the water intake, I called Director Butler about, probably 6 days before the Toledo shutdown, and suggested to Craig that, we were in for a major problem and it was coming soon. Now, that particular year wasn't the biggest of algal blooms, but it was more caused by the direction of the wind and currents for that year, and it concentrated that algal bloom right around the water intake. I leave out of a marina that is right by the water intake, so every day I was running through blooms that were 6, 8, 12 inches deep, solid, with microcystin algae, and making Craig aware I thought was extremely important, because we had been and still are working strongly with Ohio's governor and their team of experts. But, I guess what you really look at, and as Gail alluded to, when you look at all the issues that we face, it could all be tracked down to whether it was a dry year or whether it was a wet year. And I know last year we had personally predicted higher concentrations of microcystin, and indeed I think that would have been the case, but we entered into a drought as of the beginning of July, and from July through September there was no more contribution of phosphorus and nitrogen to the watershed. So because of that drought, and the quick passage of water through the Western Basin, because of its shallowness and warmness, we avoided it. And I've already heard a couple of state senators and we don't understand why we didn't have it. Well, if you look at rainfall, you look at contribution, it's pretty easy to understand. You know, if you want to fertilize your dandelions, they'll grow really, really well. If you don't fertilize them, they'll still grow pretty well, but not as good as if you really pamper them rascals. The other thing, through Lake Erie Charter Boat Association, we make a yearly, and sometimes I think Dave, the year before last, went to Washington for separate times to talk to senators and congressmen in behalf of Lake Erie. We have a strong relationship with the Ohio DNR and the Ohio EPA and Ag. We are building on a relation with them. And this is the way we as private business can actually help. Now, that same year, we started a water monitoring program. We do that on our own dime, and Dave is now the leader of it, where I was for the first 5 years. But we'll go out every Monday and collect water samples throughout the lake. This was extremely important before we had so many different monitors and sensors out there. But I guess why I'm saying all these things that we're involved in is private business brings a lot of clout to this problem. It puts a face to the problem. And, there's a lot of things that we could do as individuals or as businesses that really don't cost that much for us to do. But it shows that we're willing to get involved in the problem and trying to find a solution to the problem. And if anything, this group really represents to me an opportunity for more businesses and more people to get involved in being part of the solution. And that's all I got.
Kevin, well, thank you so much.
Articulated it perfectly. Like, why do you want to be part of that?
Sorry, who was just speaking? It didn't come all the way through. Sorry about that. Okay. Captain Paul, I really appreciate that perspective. And Dave, did you happen to be able to join?
I thought Dave was out fishing today. I think I
got a note saying that he was going to be in a charter and that he was going to try to join. And so Thank you. I appreciate it very, very much. And please pass along my thanks to him as well. I know he did join earlier, but he must have had to jump off. So I want to take this time to open up folks that have questions. Please go ahead and unmute yourself, and I will, after we do questions, I will dive a little bit into where we're going to position ourselves as a network and kind of go over again some of the policy.
Okay, I'm back.
Oh, hi.
Okay, this is Captain Dave.
Hi, thank you.
Hi. I'll go through some stuff really quickly here. I live in Carroll Township in Ottawa County, and a lot of people did not know this, and it kind of got blown away, but Carroll Township was the first in the state of Ohio to have a do not drink warning put out. And we thought that was going to really get things underway and try to do some things, but unfortunately, I guess it was too small of a situation. It's a small place, so there's only 2,000 people involved with getting that water. And it's the same situation as happened in Toledo, but on a much smaller scale. And this was September 3rd, 2013. And that's one of those things that really, when you get the call like that, and you go through a lot of emotions, and you actually end up saying, why in the world can this be happening at this time of the, it's 2013, gang, what's going on here? Mm-hmm. Very upsetting. The water treatment facility is very new in comparison with a lot of places. So they already had all the supposedly bells and whistles, but it still wasn't good enough to keep things under control for the toxins. And fortunately, and this applies to all the water treatment guys along the lake, they've done an excellent job in testing, even though they were not required to, and they kept up with it, spent money to have it happen, and let us know what's going on. So those guys really have they need the tip of the hat for those folks, because they did a tremendous job. And at that time, these alerts were going out based on the World Health Organization's numbers, and everything was exceeding those numbers, and that's why the calls came. It's the following spring, that facility added an ozone system in it. And these are the kind of numbers that get people's attention. They spent 1/3 of their entire year's budget just to build and put that equipment in there. So, of course, those are the kind of things that get pushed off to the rate papers, and the same situation has happened over the years in Toledo. I think their rates are usually about 13% annually to put new equipment, new chemicals, and do all the work to make sure that those situations don't happen again. The other part that is a little bit worrisome is the fact that within 2 miles of that water treatment facility is one of the larger marinas in Ottawa County. And in fact, it has the largest charter boat fleet in that marina. So you've got a restaurant, a gas station, a dock, fuel dock, and all of the marina facilities there. Lots and lots of people go through something like that, and those are the kind of bad things that happen that people decide, well, I'm not going back there again. And that's kind of what started us with our businesses going downhill when the balloons start to show up in the news reports, and the people now know how to look at satellites. People will decide, okay, I'm going to take my vacation someplace other than there. So when we look into some of these years, 2014, 2015 was just the worst thing we've ever had. We basically stopped fishing for about 6.5, 7 weeks. And of course, with our business being seasonal to start with, we can't make up losses for that kind of time there. People either didn't call to go, or if they had already scheduled a trip, decided not to go because of the situation out in the lake. And that kind of mushrooms out into other people. Again, I mentioned that those marinas there, the fuel dock never gets used because the boats don't go out. We have folks that work there that are actually, their family business is cleaning fish for people. So, of course, we don't go out and come back with fish, so they don't have income coming. It just kind of blows around and gets bigger and bigger. And this has been going on now for 4 and 5 years here. So our late season just doesn't happen like it used to. So it's one of those things that the bottom line gets hit pretty hard from our standpoint. And obviously there are other people involved in the business. And, you know, the tourism industry in Ohio is huge. You know, it's a third of it just is on these 8 counties that go along the south shore of Lake Erie. So as that tourism business goes, it really reflects on how good or sometimes not so good the condition of the lake is. That 2015 one, at one point I could go due north out of our marina, and I would be in green water and run due north all the way and run into the Canadian shore and never get out of the green water. So that was how vast that one covered. It's amazing to have a go that far. One of the other things that we've been doing over the years is we do a lot of boat tours, if you want to call them. In some cases, we actually have them fish too, but we've taken an awful lot of farm groups out on the lake. Sometimes we've had as many as 20 boats with guys on it going out, and usually we try to get that set up usually in late July, early August, where they can get out and actually see what it looks like. And that usually is an eye-opener. It's one of those where visually, if you see it on TV or a satellite picture, it's one thing. But when you're sitting in a boat surrounded by green as far as you can see, plus the fact that you can smell it, it kind of gets a different perspective of what's going on there. So we've been doing that for quite a few years here now, and continue to do that. And I've gone out and do quite a few presentations to farm groups also. So the biggest thing we try to push there, especially when we're out doing our water sampling, we usually have a crew with us that are actually coming out to fish. So they get to see firsthand on what we do. And of course, we've got a handout to go with it, but they actually see that there's people looking and trying to find out any kind of information they can. So it's a good promo for getting some education to anybody and everybody we can possibly do. And that includes most of the time with the folks with the local TV groups that we take out, and they take their cameras out, of course, and that gets on the 6 o'clock news, those kind of things. So outreach is a big part of it, because there's still an awful lot of people that, believe it or not, they live only maybe 100 miles from Lake Erie itself, and they actually have never seen Lake Erie. So it's one of those not my problem type things. So education is a real biggie from our standpoint. So I'll stop there.
Thank you thank you both so much. It's eye-opening to hear your accounts and how this is impacting you very directly. And I'm hoping that as the business network can dive more into this issue, we can be of assistance to the great work you've already done. So thank you for everything that you have done to date and continue to do. So I want to open it up to questions. Do folks within the business network have any questions for Frank, Gail, Captain Dave, or Captain Paul? Great. So I'll then take this opportunity to dive in a little bit into what the business network is planning to do in the next few weeks. So we, as Frank and Gail covered, we will really push to renew the commitment for a 40% reduction through both education and policy advocacy to decision makers. And we already have a lobbyist in Ohio that is a part of their work is to work with the business network to keep them engaged and updated on policies that are moving that could aid in the renewed commitment to 40% reduction. We also have a contractor in Ontario that is keeping their finger on the pulse for the Ontario politics. And what we're going to do in the next couple of weeks is develop an outreach or a sign-on letter where individual businesses within the network and businesses that we hope to bring into the network within the basin can sign on, which will push decision makers both in the U.S., in Ohio and Michigan, and then in Ontario to work together to find solutions. That those solutions should have metrics to them to ensure that we are moving the needle, and that we want them to commit to that 40% reduction. So these are very high level asks, but we want to make sure that they are aware that the business community is paying attention, that they want solutions to this problem, and that it is a very important aspect to our overall economy and the health of the Great Lakes. And so in the next week, you'll see this sign-on letter come through. We hope that the current businesses will sign on individually, and that if you have folks within your network that you think would be interested in this issue, especially businesses that you work with in Lake Erie that you think would be interested in joining the network for this issue, please, let me know, and I would be happy to facilitate any conversations around that. I also want, and Mike is on, and so I want to give him an opportunity to cover anything I might have missed. He's also been working in this space for a while now from NWF's perspective, and then I'll let folks ask any additional questions. Great. Well, it's either a good thing. It's people are overwhelmed, or we did such a great job that no one has questions. Not quite sure which one it is, but hopefully we did a great job. So like I said, this has been recorded, and so we will get this around to our network members that could not join today. And again, I thank everyone that was able to join and give perspective.
Thanks, Beth.
Yeah, thank you. Everybody have a
Okay, thank you.
weekend.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much.